Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third and final installment of the 2025 Mosse Lecture Series, named for the path-breaking scholar of European cultural history, George L. Mosse. This series was inaugurated in 2002. The lectures alternate between the two institutions where George Mosse taught, here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I'd like to note that this year's Madison lectures are supported by the George L. Mosse Program in History, as well as numerous other units on campus, the Department of History, the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Plus, the Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence, as well as the Center for German and European Studies. So those of you who have already been here know that we're very fortunate to have as our speaker this year Professor Johannes von Moltke, who is the Rudolf Arnheim Collegiate Professor of German Studies in Film, Media, and Television at the University of Michigan. Professor von Moltke is a scholar in the fields of German cinema, cultural history, and critical theory. In addition to his numerous articles, essays, and edited volumes, he has authored two prize-winning books that have been mentioned, but I'll repeat them. No Place Like Home, Locations of Heimat in German Cinema, and The Curious Humanist, Siegfried Kracauer in America, which was a Choice Outstanding Academic title. Most recently, Professor von Moltke held a 2024 fellowship at the American Academy of Berlin, where he conducted research for his current and very timely project on the Identitarian reflex, critical theory, and the metapolitics of the new right. So the Mosse Lectures are giving us a taste of this important work. And today's third and final installment is entitled Prophets of Deceit, Genealogies of Agitation and the Critical Theory of Metapolitics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Johannes von Moltke.
Thank you for coming back. Thank you for sticking it out. Thank you again for having me. And also, the co-sponsors who've been listed a number of times. I mean, I've been around this block of working with colleagues in other parts of the institution, and I really appreciate the buy-in from different parts of campus. I changed a tiny bit of the title. That'll hopefully explain itself. It's now Podcasters instead of Prophets, because I do want to say a little bit about podcasting before I go back, as promised, into at least a beginning of a historicization of the present moment. But that's actually where I start. So I want to start with a brief prologue that takes us back to a publication from November of 1945 in Commentary, where half a year after the end of the Nazi regime in Germany, the writer and journalist James Rorty, I believe that's the father of the philosopher Richard, published a short article entitled American Führer in Dress Rehearsal. In this article, he warned of, quote, scores of more or less pathological, more or less venal agitators who will try to exploit the market for anti-Semitism created by the economic and social tensions of our post-war adjustment. Though these agitators frequently, as he puts it, talk and act like lunatics, he insisted that they be, quote, regarded as potentially serious political forces who, given favoring soil and season, might easily grow and flourish disastrously. While the United States certainly flirted with fascism after the Great Depression and throughout the 1930s, think of Lindbergh and the America First movement, it's jarring to read about pro-Nazi demagoguery in late 1945, in full knowledge of the horrors wrought by the Nazi regime in Germany and across Europe. Among the resurgent brass-lunged fundamentalist showmen Rorty identified were the likes of Gerald L.K. Smith, erstwhile national organizer for Huey Long and founder of the Christian Nationalist Crusade and 1944 presidential candidate for the America First Party that he also founded. And I just learned, I should have known this a long time ago, but his papers are at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, in case you're interested. Other people he mentions are Joe McWilliams, or Mr. McNazi, as Time magazine called him, a seditionist sympathizer of the German-American Bund, who tried to organize and run for a party on the model of the NSDAP. And the serving North Carolina Senator Bob Reynolds, an apologist for the Nazi cause. Writes Rorty, since experience teaches us to regard such developments seriously, the systematic study of these would-be American Führers is very much in order. You'll have guessed that my conclusion is that the systematic study Rorty called for in 1945 remains warranted. While the names of some of these men are largely forgotten today, the rise of the new right has spawned forms of demagoguery that arguably harken back to the perilous moment Rorty describes. To be sure, the situation has changed, not least in terms of the media through which such demagoguery can spread. If Rorty's American Führers still largely took to the radio airwaves, today's brass-lunged fundamentalist showmen are largely on YouTube and social media, generating alternative influence networks, or hosting their own podcasts. So now I'd like to spend a moment surveying a tiny corner of the podcasting landscape because I think it's one of the conduits on the backwards escalator that I'm interested in that we can then historicize. I can go on for a long time, as you know, says Steve Bannon, about 12 minutes into the 473rd episode of his podcast, War Room Battleground. Those who follow his show do indeed know Bannon can extemporize for hours on end, long enough to upload at least 2-hour-long episodes daily to dozens of platforms since first launching the podcast in October 2019 to combat Donald Trump's first impeachment. Long enough to be closing in on 5,000 shows and counting. Long enough to clog up the airways and flood the zone with shit, as Bannon has described his strategy, if you can call it that. Long enough, in other words, for the one-time head of Breitbart News and Trump White House strategist to make his mark across multiple platforms as a key purveyor of far-right punditry, an amplifier of conspiracy theories, a Trump apostle. Bannon's War Room now ranks 10th among political shows on Apple Podcasts, well ahead of podcasts from the New York Times or the left-wing progressive channel MSNBC. From behind his desk, he commands a loyal audience that he addresses as the War Room Posse, and he certainly has Trump's ear. For all of Bannon's logorrhea, War Room revolves around a limited set of themes: the invasion of the United States by immigrants, the spiraling debt and the imminent end of the dollar empire, Christian nationalism, and the hated elites with their ostensible globalist agendas. With these themes, Bannon taps into the same, quote, rich alluvial deposit of Middle Western fundamentalism, populism, and crackpot money theologies, end of quote, that Rorty saw as operative in 1945. But it is the populist vein that turns out to be the most productive for Bannon. The constantly maligned elites are ultimately just the foil to the common man who forms the epicenter around which all of the show's rhetoric spins, beginning with the opening montage of each episode. And I'm going to subject you to just a little bit, and then I'll move on, of how this begins every time. Oh,
This is the final scream of a dying regime.
you can't hear that in the back, huh? Yeah.
We're going medieval on these people. We're not going to get a free shot at all these networks lying about the people. The people have had a belly full of it. I know you don't like hearing that. I know you try to do everything in the world to stop that, but you're not going to stop it. It's going to happen.
And where do people like that go to share the big lie? MAGA media. I wish, in my soul, I wish that any of these people had a conscience.
Ask yourself, what is my task and what is my purpose? If that answer is to save my country, this country will be saved.
War Room. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Whether through direct address, when he says, this is what you're fighting for, I mean every day you're out there, or through the first person plural of War Room, pray for our enemies, because we're going medieval on these people, Bannon addresses his listeners as the people arrayed against the elites. In the fact-free opinionating of his subsequent monologues that people shows up again and again in second-person acknowledgments. You know, you've been there, you're the ones who made Trump happen, you're the most powerful force in the United States today, and you are one of the most powerful forces in the history of the Republic. You stood in the breach, end of quote. The podcast then serves to harness and weaponize that audience as what Bannon calls the tip of the spear. This address, the second-person singular address, carries through from the editorial content of the podcast, such as it is, to the show's sponsorship messaging, and by extension, to its business model. Featuring only host-read ads, the kind that are characteristic of influencer marketing, as opposed to sponsor-produced or announcer-read branded content, the podcast has attracted sponsorship from companies such as Patreon Mobile, Patriotic Supply, Birch Gold, MyPillow, and Jace Medical. In his recommendations for these companies' products, and he often has the people who, the CEOs like Mike Lindell from MyPillow shows up on his show a lot. In his recommendations for these companies' products, which range from prepper kits to patriotic cell phone plans to soul tea for lionhearts strong enough to fight for Trump, and from bedding to bullion to tax advice, don't take out a loan to pay off your taxes, Bannon will invariably appeal to the prospective buyers, that is to his audience, as strung out, downtrodden, beleaguered, and misled by nefarious forces. So I'm trying to suggest that the way the advertising is pitched is the same way that the editorial content is pitched. The advertising model plainly addresses lower and middle class concerns and holds out the promise of defending them against a corrupt elite whom the editorial content of the show variously calls the globalists, the lords of easy money and big tech, or members of the censorship industrial complex, among other things. Elites spur the ongoing invasion of the United States by immigrants, deny the alleged fact that Trump won the 2020 election, and hand out testosterone to transgender youth like it's candy. That was a quote. Elites are the ones that lead the cult ideology of climate change, which, since it's supposedly unprovable by any set of mathematics or anything in the physical world, I'm quoting Bannon, he likens it to a medieval theology. Such statements only provide glimpses into the larger ideology of the podcast, which is committed to nothing if not disinformation. As a 2023 Brookings Institution report pointed out, War Room is the runaway leader among political podcasts in propagating the big lie, peddling unsubstantiated COVID claims, and spreading conspiracy theories. If we look to the other side of the Atlantic for party-adjacent, pre- or meta-political media work in support of the parliamentary far right, which is how I would describe War Room, the tone and the personalities are somewhat less brash, but no less influential. The pundits who have the ear of the most radical politicians in Germany sit again in Schnellroda. You've heard the name of the town a number of times now. As part of its multimedia strategy, the group around Kubitschek, too, has turned to podcasting. Usually accompanied by a coterie of collaborators, Kubitschek engages in irregular but lengthy conversations under the passive-aggressive title Am Rande der Gesellschaft, on the borders or fringes of society. Like Bannon's show, this podcast is freewheeling, covering issues in culture and politics, and generally responding to current events. But unlike War Room, its preferred mode is discussion rather than diatribe, breaking down arguments rather than burning things down. Bannon is brash, Kubitschek is debonair. Bannon harangues his interlocutors, Kubitschek respectfully converses. Where War Room is loud, angry, and populist, Am Rande der Gesellschaft is conversational, comparatively quiet, and always in black and white. And I think I have the opening of this one for you too. This is, again, the media use is interesting that they have the typewriter always. And then you have horns.
Herzlich willkommen zur 37. Folge am Rande der Gesellschaft. Heute ist als Gast aus Wien Martin Sellner hier. Herzlich willkommen. Und ansonsten in der Runde Götz Kubitschek, Dr. Erik Lehnert und meine Wenigkeit Ellen Kositzer.
You see there again Martin Sellner, who I'm going to mention again in a minute with his own podcast. This is part of the way they construct networks. They constantly host each other. And it does, if you kind of move around in these spheres, it does at some points feel rather incestuous. Like they're really constantly just each other's guests. And then I don't know if you heard the emphasis on Dr. Erich Lehnert. They do care about the titles and the academic pedigrees at the same time that they have to play them down for their populist messaging. The same thing is absolutely true for Bannon, who will parade his Harvard pedigree. He went to the business school there, but at the same time, make sure that he's a man of the people. I'll get back to that later. Overall, the podcast Am Rande der Gesellschaft is a smaller piece of the metapolitical puzzle than Bannon's War Room. Rather than twice daily, the show has been dropping once or twice a month since its inception in May 2020, shortly after the Institut für Staatspolitik was put under observation by the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution. The format of the show also differs significantly from War Room, replacing Bannon's anchor concept with a structured conversation among Kubitschek, Kozica, and at least one invited guest. Among the latter, as I just said, we will usually find the usual Schnellroder suspects, but just as Bannon will invite Marjorie Taylor Greene when he gets the chance, so are Kubitschek and Kozica happy to share their time at the microphone with leading AfD politicians such as Björn Höcke or Maximilian Krah. Another well-liked guest is the man you saw here, Martin Sellner. Nominally based in Vienna, he fashions himself as a man on the move, evading the authorities whom he targets with ceaseless activism. Sellner cuts a figure that brings together Bannon's brash activism with Kubitschek's learned disquisitions. A co-founder of the Identitarian movement in Austria, Sellner has trademarked the role of the activist provocateur in the German-speaking New Right. As such, he gained renewed notoriety through his involvement in a November 2023 meeting that I mentioned yesterday in Potsdam, at which he presented a master plan for what the right calls remigration. The journalistic research collective Correctiv reported on the meeting, which led to massive protests across the Federal Republic, as well as a short-lived travel ban on Sellner. And it was entirely in keeping with Sellner's persona and the media strategies that he has cultivated that he immediately took to the airwaves to discuss his response to the travel ban in his weekly podcast, Audio Analysen. So he turns a travel ban into a kind of it's useful for the self-victimization strategy, but B, it's also a conduit for establishing a rapport with his listeners, because he asked them, how do you think I should respond? So he uses the podcast almost as a two-way medium. These are weekly podcasts, Audio Analysen. Available to subscribers on Sellner's website, these podcasts complement his long-running series MS Live, Martin Sellner Live, streaming on platforms like Getter and Rumble, where Sellner teams up with Friedrich Langberg to review the week's news from a far-right perspective. And I'll play you just the beginning of this. This is the kind of apocalyptic, prepper, accelerationist imagery that I was talking about. Then they start talking reflexively about how their show is going and how the intro came too early, and then they actually go on to muse about how great this little montage is that you just saw of images of war, apocalypse, cataclysm. In the far-right podcasting space I aim to map out here, Sellner again brings up the middle in that he shares Kubitschek's penchant for theorizing, but Bannon's populist direct appeal to his audience. As if to illustrate his indefatigable metapolitical drive, Sellner records his audio analysen on the road from inside his moving car. This is him recording one of those, and he's actually on the Autobahn. So as to use every minute of my day politically, as he puts it, or rather metapolitically. Like Kubitschek and his conversation partners, and unlike Bannon, Sellner speaks in complete sentences that appear structured into paragraphs, aiming less to harangue than to persuade. He shares with Schnellroder an investment in intellectual work, in the sharpening of concepts that we discussed yesterday, of concepts such as assimilation, remigration, Leitkultur, identitarianism, or the Great Replacement. He will do short segments, short shows on these concepts, actually. In his podcast, Zellner spends a lot of time deriving these and other notions from the theoretical canon of the New Right, referring his listeners to earlier shows and to relevant writings. While Zellner's podcast is thus perhaps closer to the one by Kubitschek, the black and white one, Am Rande der Gesellschaft, in terms of its intellectual ambition, it does share with War Room the direct appeal to listeners that is somewhat missing or muted in Schnellruder. In welcoming users to his show by their handles as they join on various platforms, pitching questions to his audience, and suggesting that their answers might influence his own next steps, Zellner marries the populist appeal of his politics to the affordances of the podcasting ecosystem, gaining subscribers along the way. So for all their differences, Bannon, Kubitschek, and Zellner position themselves with their persona and their podcasts in comparable ways, both politically and culturally. The media strategies they pursue and the contents they peddle position them both to the right of any institutionalized party, if not outside of the party-based system of representative democracy as such. When Bannon rails against the, quote, credentialed class and rallies the war room posse to pray for our enemies because we're going medieval on these people, it's difficult to see how the cataclysm he wishes upon the United States could possibly leave democratic structures intact. And while Kubitschek will always be careful to cultivate his democratic bona fides in public, he also entertains fantasies of collapse, in his case, couched in the language of the conservative revolution, of the interwar years, and the geistiger Bürgerkrieg, or spiritual civil war that we discussed yesterday, in the present. Zellner finally appears to test the resilience of democratic structures by stretching them to their breaking points, forcing a travel ban that reveals the limits of liberalism's commitment to freedom of speech and movement. In these ways, the three figures have strategically concentrated their operations in what we've been describing as the metapolitical realm, or as I said on Tuesday, what is sometimes rendered as vorpolitisch in German, pre-political, a space in which they seek to commandeer cultural and political discourses and prepare for what the far right calls the Reconquista. That term may serve as a useful reminder that metapolitics was never removed by more than one degree of separation from the political realm proper. Bannon served as Donald Trump's campaign manager in 2016 and chief White House strategist, and who knows what's coming now after he's out of prison again. Kubitschek, who uses the formal Sie to address his wife, is on Du with Björn Höcke, the head of the AfD's most extreme right wing, der Flügel. The fact that Zellner's metapolitical agitation too translates directly into party political planning was among the most explosive revelations of that 2024 Korrektiv report. When that hit the public, the outcry was about the concept of remigration, and maybe justifiably so, but to anybody who is reading the writings of the New Right, that was plain. I mean, that was really no surprise. It was spelled out in entire books. What wasn't plain was that there was a direct communication going on between the party and the metapolitical organizers. So that to me was the kind of explosive message of this investigative reporting. So even though they're very close to politics, the media space of the podcast conveniently allows the three men to position themselves as pundits rather than politicians, as Stichwortgeber or prompters rather than lawmakers, in other words, as purveyors of metapolitics. In this regard, Bannon, Kubitschek, and Zellner operate in a right-wing podcasting ecosystem that also includes shows by the likes of Alex Jones on InfoWars, Ben Shapiro on The Daily Wire, or Dave Rubin of The Rubin Report, who we saw on the book club yesterday with Michael Knowles, to name just a few. All of these podcasts operate on multiple platforms and within larger media ecologies that connect them to audiovisual media like YouTube, news-like websites such as Breitbart News, and to the web of mediated relations that Becca Lewis describes as the alternative influence network. And I can't remember if I mentioned it in the lectures or in one of the many interesting conversations I've had in the last 3 days with some of you. this is her work now from 2018, and I was in the conversation I had with somebody. We were thinking that we should probably redo this because of I think we were talking about this, right? Yeah, because there might be this is an alternative influence network that largely has people on the far right, like Nick Fuentes, the Holocaust denier who visited the White House. I don't know who are people you might. Here's Dave Rubin, and you see Laura Southern. You see like how they invite each other, so that creates the nodes. Richard Spencer's up here. They show up on each other's. Milo Yiannopoulos down here. But as Brandon was pointing out, there's likely a kind of fluid boundary between this network and kind of the infotainment world that is not politically coded entirely as right, and maybe sometimes even coded as progressive, and they still invite each other on each other's shows, like Ben Shapiro moves, or Jordan, or Austin, what's his name, not Oscar Peterson. Jordan Peterson, right? Yeah, Jordan. So who have this, university, slightly cult following and seem quasi-respectable until you look at where they sit in these networks. And so this is very revealing research that I've always considered really important too. As background to what I'm doing, it was inspiring to come across it when she published it. Similar to the YouTube sphere that Lewis analyzes, the podcast arena is particularly suitable for metapolitical networking, since from the beginning there have been few barriers of entry and virtually no regulation. A recent report from the Brookings Institution estimates that there exist over 75 million recorded podcast episodes, and that nearly 41% of Americans now listen to podcasts in any given month, while almost 1 in 4 turn to podcasts as their news source. The global audience quadrupled from 2017 to 2021 and is set to almost double again by 2027. So think of that in terms also of the advertising strategies of somebody like Bannon. It now exceeds 500 million listeners, and it's a lucrative industry. Advertising revenue worldwide has almost doubled in the past few years, from $2.1 billion in 2021 to $4.2 billion in 2024. Such projections and the affordances of contemporary media help to shape right-wing podcasting as a novel phenomenon. And yet, we should not let this blind us to the deep history of conservative media activism on which they build. And this is the moment where I try to turn us back, if not directly to Rorty, then to the question of how we might think of these kinds of metapolitical podcasting strategies in relationship to an earlier history of radio that was analyzed in the 1940s by members of the Frankfurt School. So that's where I'm going to wind up these lectures. So I'm not concluding it, but that's the last section, essentially. Just as the new media offerings in Schnellrode are built around the old medium of the book, as we discussed, or the typewriter that shows up at the beginning of these podcasts, so does the turn to podcasting inherit a long tradition of right-wing agitation, whose roots we can trace back to Goebbels' use of the ubiquitous Volksempfänger in Germany, or Father Coughlin's anti-Semitic radio harangues, which by some estimates reached 1 in 3 Americans week after week during the 1930s. 1 in 3. And I think that's counting the entire population, kids, babies. In other words, podcasters like Bannon, Kubitschek, and Zellner belong to a much longer history of conservative media activism, to which Rorty was already responding in 1945 when he wrote about the American Führer in Dress Rehearsal, a dress rehearsal that now becomes legible as the prehistory of the present, where Rorty's brass-lunged fundamentalist showmen have traded the broadcasting medium for podcasts. Historians and media scholars have begun to trace this lineage from P.T. Barnum to Pat Buchanan to Rush Limbaugh and Tucker Carlson. But for the purposes of historicizing the present turn to metapolitics, the period that should most concern us is America's explicit flirtation with authoritarianism from the 1930s onward, when, in the words of Danielle Lee Thompson, the radio demagogue was the catalyzing focus for a specific strand of American fascism. To be sure, there's been good reason during the ongoing centennial of the Weimar Republic to look to Germany for lessons learned about the death spirals of democracy. And I've talked also to some of you recently about, is 2025 1931, or is it 1932, or have we passed January of 1933? I mean, these are, I think, relevant questions, most often not with straightforward answers, but the echoes are worth exploring. But from a transatlantic perspective, the tenuous period in US history from the stock market crash in 1929 and into McCarthyism seems to me as relevant for thinking about the renewed rise of the right today as the conservative revolution and the waning of German democracy during the interwar years. For this purpose, we can draw on important work by historians on America's flirtation with fascism, where books like Bradley Hart's Hitler's American Friends or a recent anthology on fascism in America stand as stark warnings about American democracy's susceptibility to authoritarian temptations. But if these texts implicitly construe the past as prequel, to invoke the title of Rachel Maddow's recent book on the subject, we might now also wish to reverse the perspective and ask what it means to revisit the prehistory armed with present knowledge. How, in other words, might we reread earlier threats to democracy through the culturalist lens of metapolitics, whose implications for the present we've been developing here? From our contemporary vantage point, indeed, the various activities in the United States of the German-American Bund and the seditious silver shirts, German cultural organizations and Aryan bookstores, such as the one that I know existed in Los Angeles, but probably other places too, but also Charles Lindbergh's speeches on behalf of the isolationist America First movement, and indeed the radio proselytizing of Father Coughlin, G.L.K. Smith, and Martin Luther Thomas, and others, appear as so many metapolitical machinations designed to foster fascist sympathies. It bears repeating that these activities marked fascist organizing in the United States as a culturalist undertaking, first and foremost, often in the sphere of religious culture, bearing out George Mosse's fundamental insight that, especially where it seeks to learn through transnational comparison, the analysis of fascism must begin from an understanding of culture. Otherwise, Mosse warns, we are liable to, quote, underestimate fascism, see it as a temporary response to crises, vanishing when normality is restored, end of quote. But there's a second reason for returning to the historical period of fascism in the US, which appears oddly absent from most historical work on the period. These books I have on the screen, for example. For the metapolitics of the moment, such as they were, captured the attention of contemporary cultural critics and theorists whose analyses far outlast the immediate post-war context in which they were conceived. I'm referring here principally to the work of the Institute for Social Research, the Frankfurt School in exile, itself a transnational theoretical conjuncture, if there ever was one. Their writings from the 1940s, I finally want to suggest, offer a theoretical compendium to what we've been calling metapolitics here, and what they labeled agitation at the time. I've already had occasion to point to the relevance of Theodor Adorno's and Max Horkheimer's analyses of anti-Semitism for thinking through the projective character of metapolitics. But even as they were working on their seminal dialectic of enlightenment, in which the fragments of anti-Semitism from which I was quoting appear, the two men were engaged with their institute colleagues in a number of other projects directly responsive to the rise of those brass-lunged would-be American Führers of whom James Rorty had warned. In the context of a joint research project with the Jewish American Committee, entitled Studies in Prejudice, Institute members drew the portrait of the American agitator, whom they labeled Prophets of Deceit in their 1949 book by that title. Several years earlier, Theodor Adorno had already studied the psychological techniques of one such radio personality named Martin Luther Thomas. Although that 1943 study remained unpublished during his lifetime, it was known to his fellow members at the Institute and provided an empirical data point that Adorno brought to the massive and massively impactful authoritarian personality. That book, published like the Prophets of Deceit in the Studies in Prejudice series, was admittedly concerned less with the production of propaganda than with the fertile ground that the agitator's harangues found in the potentially fascist personality, the key focus and worry of the volume's contributors. And this is a point that I think gets under-remembered, underreported in the references that we often see to the authoritarian personality today, and in the way we use the term authoritarianism, which evokes the notion of the strongman. In Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book by that title, Strongman, Mussolini, Hitler, and others, where I'm assuming, I'm guessing, there's a short circuit between authoritarianism and strongman. Those are the authoritarians. In that study, the authoritarians are the people following the strongman. So to be authoritarian, or the autoritäre Charakter in German is the translation, which is interesting, or the authoritarian personality, is the personality of the follower who desires an authoritarian, well, then I shouldn't use it again, who desires a hard-fisted ruler. And I think this is quite important for the way we think about the metapolitical project as producing and reproducing the authoritarian personality in the audience of these shows. Taken together, this voluminous work sought to study prejudice as a socio-psychological force that ramified through the structures of capitalism and liberal democracy and was susceptible to demagogic capture, right? So you can capture authoritarian personalities, and the demagogues are the ones who do that capture. In this sense, the critical theorists looked both ways, at the production of authoritarian propaganda by fascist agitators and at the fertile ground on which it could thrive. Situated at the contested meeting grounds of German social theory in the tradition of Hegel and Marx, Freud and Weber on the one hand, and budding American empirical social science on the other, the Institute for Social Research opted for what they called qualitative and what communication studies calls qualitative content analysis. In this, they were guided in part by a pioneering study by Alfred and Elizabeth Lee on the fine art of propaganda, which had proposed a set of 7 tricks of the trade, replete with emojis designed for close analyses. So you can actually see all these tricks have their little emojis, and then you can code the text and they do that. And I don't have an example here, but they give you a speech and they kind of insert the emojis so you know which trick is being used. For all their playfulness, these icons visualize a basic methodological commitment of content analysis to coding the material, allowing the researcher eventually to quantify and analyze the otherwise inchoate, messy utterances. Although the critical theorists would insist, by contrast, that any such empirical work would need to be accompanied, if not shaped from the start, by a theory of society, Löwenthal and Adorno, too, found themselves confronted with the need to establish a material basis for their studies. So, working through reams of pamphlets and transcripts of radio addresses, in the case of the agitators, and through countless hours of interview material, in the case of the authoritarian personality, they emulated the classificatory schema of the Lee's propaganda study, which they reference, seeking to identify, quote, a unifying pattern of certain recurrent motifs, or in other words, what they call the constants of agitation. The goal for them was to call out and name the devices or tricks by which agitators baited and duped their listeners. It's tempting to read these works as manuals for decoding the agitational material of the new right's metapolitics today. As contemporary scholars have noted in their forewords and afterwords to several new editions of these texts, they do feel newly relevant today, in large part because they succinctly outline agitational themes, demagogic devices, and psychological techniques that we do see the right wing using again today. To give some examples, for readers of Prophets of Deceit, the 1949 study, it's hard not to see Stephen Bannon's brand of accelerationism in Löwenthal's description of the agitator as, quote, the enemy of all established values, the spokesman of the apocalypse, and the carrier of disaffection. So that's the text from 1949, and it's hard not to just think, oh, that was written for Bannon. Similarly, The principal purveyors of metapolitics on both sides of the Atlantic, whether Breitbart or Bannon, Kubitschek or Sellner, appear as so many reincarnations of the agitator as the great little man, a figure that Löwenthal and Gutermann describe as both almost indistinguishable from the great mass of American citizens and yet, quote, clearly one of the endogamic elite. And this is exactly the play that Bannon is making for being a West Point graduate and a Harvard educated, and at the same time being just one of us arrayed against the globalist elite. This quintessentially populist subject position afforded the likes of Father Coughlin or G.L.K. Smith platforms for calls to arms, even as they cloaked their appeals to violence in religious language and the rhetorics of plausible deniability. In this manner, the fascist agitator of the 1930s would always suggest that, quote, what is necessary, and now I'm quoting again from 1949, sorry, I'm skipping time frames, but that's the point. So now we're talking about the 1930s again in the language of the 1949 study, which says that the fascist agitator of the 1930s would, quote, always suggest that what is necessary is the elimination of people rather than a change in political structure. Whether this takes the form of mass firing of government workers, Bannon's threat to go medieval on these people, or Kubitschek's advocacy for a spiritual civil war, the resonances of such formulations make a case for anchoring today's metapolitics in a historicizing approach to the constants of agitation. At the same time, Löwenthal and Gutermann intimate already in 1949 that the fantasies of violence find their clearest expression where they are projected onto the other. Remember at all times, says the historical agitator they're quoting, that the tactics employed by these usurpers of Christian liberties will be to create horror and panic by exhibitions of maximum brutalities. This anti-Semitic projection of the agitator's own violent urges climaxes just a few lines later in the claim by the agitator of the 1930s that Hitler and Hitlerism are the creatures of Jewry and Judaism. This pattern should be familiar by now, and it includes the same reverse victimization that we saw in Martin Lichtmesser's redefinition of white masculinity as colonized and oppressed. Correspondingly, the Institute series on agitation pinpointed a mirror world of simulacra eerily reminiscent of Naomi Klein's much more recent analysis. Describing the very patterns of aggressive resignification that we discussed yesterday, Adorno writes about Martin Luther Thomas's radio addresses that their ultimate aim is probably not so much the selling of false argumentation as indeed the complete breakdown of a logical sense within the listeners and eventually the collapse of any meaning that the idea of truth may have for them. And this is the kind of insight from 1943 that you'll find again in the authoritarian personality. Those are the authoritarians. In views of such resonances, these books lend a whole new dimension to Alex Ross's quip in The New Yorker that the Frankfurt School knew that Trump was coming, a claim that he derived largely from the Institute's analysis of neoliberalism and the dialectics of enlightenment, but which we might now reground in the genealogy that leads from the prophets of deceit to the metapolitics of the new right. But even as such resonances illuminate our present and allow us to historicize the metapolitical project, they also risk locking us into ahistorical feedback loops of retroactive prophecy, according to which Father Coughlin begets Steve Bannon and the Weimar Republic's ostensibly inevitable devolution into fascism predicts our own. Without in any way wishing to diminish the relevance and the fact that we can certainly discuss such prehistories and should compare, I do want to suggest in conclusion that the contribution of critical theory to our understanding of metapolitics lies not on the plane of repetition or analogy, Coughlin is like Bannon, but on the plane of theory itself. More specifically, in the Frankfurt School's dialectical conception of democracy and authoritarianism. So this now is my conclusion. Scholarship on the Frankfurt School has long noted that its first generation at least, not Habermas onwards, but the first generation failed to formulate a coherent theory of democracy, a surprising lacuna in light of critical theory's underlying commitments as well as the active contributions leading figures like Adorno made to rekindling a democratic public sphere in post-war Germany through teaching, research, and regular radio addresses. Those contributions were clearly honed by Adorno's experience in the United States, including with the studies of prejudice. Devoted, as we've seen, to fascist agitation and authoritarian threats, the Institute's propaganda analyses of the 1940s are surprisingly explicit about the question of democracy, offering both normative and dialectical definitions. So, for the study of Frankfurt School critical theory, and if to the degree that people agree that there's no real formulated theory of democracy, I would propose go back and look at these texts where they're actually responding to fascist agitation. Thus, while they uphold a definition of democracy as a system that guarantees minority rights, that's a quote from one of these texts, they view the agitators' countervailing insistence on the unfettered privilege of the majority as both the lie and the truth about democracy. It's the lie or false because it disavows the aspirational content of democracy, that it could be inclusive and protect minorities, but it's true in that it expresses tendencies inherent in liberal democratic societies, that they don't protect minorities. It is this dialectic that the agitator exploits by applying what Adorno designates as the democratic cloak trick. Dressing themselves in the garb of democracy, the fascist agitators blame progressive democratic institutions, whether the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s or diversity initiatives today, for, quote, being that very dictatorship at which the fascist aims. Like the democratic cloak trick itself, this charge forms an integral part of the New Right's metapolitical arsenal, where the rebranding of democracy as dictatorship follows the logic of victim reversal we've been looking at. And that counts for Lichtmesse's inversion of colonial slogans or logics or slogans like White Lives Matter, as much as for the willful rereadings of 1984 by Orwell or the simultaneous self-proclamation of Trump as king and Volodymyr Zelensky as dictator. But to unblur the concepts that metapolitics has blurred involves also refusing false equivalencies and reframing the debate. Here again, the critical theorist's historical interventions provide an important conceptual foothold for our own present. To be sure, there's something quaintly naive to their Enlightenment hope of inoculating us against fascist agitation by identifying and publicizing the agitators' recurrent tricks. Though such unmasking remains a vital aspect for any critique of right-wing metapolitics, to which I hope to have contributed a small part through these lectures. So I both do think that these little icons that you saw in Lee and Lee there's something helpless about them. And the idea that if I just identify it, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, what can I gain through a critique or an ideology critique of these texts? It's true that there's something not quite sufficient about it, but it's necessary. I would agree with them that it's necessary. It's the kind of work of, their commitment to a certain Enlightenment idea that I would share. But Adorno, Löwenthal, Marcuse, and others also always posed the question at the more fundamental level of authoritarianism as a threat to democracy. What sets their analysis apart in this regard is again their insistence on the dialectical relation between these two terms, making authoritarianism not an external threat, but a dimension integral to any theory of democracy, a recognition that colors the publication history of a volume like Prophets of Deceit. As Horkheimer wrote in his introduction to that volume in 1949, quote, demagogy makes its appearance whenever a democratic society is threatened with internal destruction. And when Herbert Marcuse introduced a new edition of the book in 1969, 20 years later, he noted that the analysis still held, but that the ideological work analyzed in the original had moved from the margins to the center, culminating in what he describes as the introjection of the agitator into the legitimate political machine, to the inside. Writing during another period of democratic backsliding in American politics, Marcuse urged readers to, quote, recognize some of the essential features of the agitator as those of the political establishment. If the antithesis between dictatorship and democracy had long been a structuring ideology of American culture, and arguably remains one, then the aftermath of fascist rule in Europe allowed their inherent entwinement to emerge more visibly than before, and we appear to be reliving such a moment. In a famous 1959 speech on coming to terms with the past, Adorno would note that, quote, the survival of National Socialism within democracy was potentially more menacing than the survival of fascistic tendencies against democracy. While I wouldn't equate the new right with National Socialism, I do think that the former harbors fascistic tendencies that menace democracy today in ways similar to those described by critical theorists in the 1940s. This is ultimately where the metapolitical rubber hits the road, or rather, to return to Breitbart's metaphor, this is where we register the downstream effects of right-wing cultural politics upstream. As Adorno noted when discussing the rise of a far-right party in Germany, the NPD that we talked about yesterday, in a lecture to students in Vienna, where we started 2 days ago, and it was 2 years before his death in 1969, he writes, fascist movements are the wounds, the scars of a democracy that to this day has not yet lived up to its own concept. The right-wing metapolitical project that I've sought to sketch here is part of that growing scar tissue, a palpable and urgent reminder of the constant work that democracy requires from all of us if it is ever to live up to its concept. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lecture and for all three lectures. You've given us, I think, so much to think with and reflect on. I'll have many questions, but maybe I'll hold my thoughts and see if there are questions from the audience that people would like to put forward. And maybe you could also briefly introduce yourself when you ask your question.
So thank you. And I kind of have a lot to say. So first I noticed that I'll just ask one question because just comments first. So I noticed that there's like a fascination about your say degree and your professions about like doing about the outright, like they would title them like doctor stuff like that. Reminds me of say a kind of predecessor here, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, who was a very demagogue, but also like kind of fascinated about his title of doctors.
Yeah.
And he once was the editor for a newspaper called, I think, Völkisch Beobachter. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the paper was kind of resonated with a modern Chinese newspaper called Guancha, which means observer, which Beobachter, I think, means observer.
Observer, yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's how we joked about that newspaper in China.
Interesting.
Because it's often filled with misinformation. Like I noticed several times they steal stuff from like from InfoWars and just delete those who were hostile about China and use the rest of them to film that it's all about the run of the Western democracy. And so I wonder if you could say about the connection between the old Nazis and the modern day outright, and if that's inherited, like their fascination about the titles, and also what kind of connection they have with the outright in Russia and in China.
Yeah, right.
Because also Russia today is kind of a popular media
Absolutely.
in China right
yeah,
now.
And elsewhere. So RT, Russia Today, is very much received on these. So I wish I knew more about Russia or China, and what you're telling me sounds fascinating. That InfoWars gets picked up without alteration, the way now in the other direction Russian propaganda talking points get picked up by the President of the United States without alteration. The fascination with the titles makes me think that this might be a beginning of an answer to the question that came up in both the previous lectures about class. that there is, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but there's one place to look, is that there is a kind of what I called academy adjacent set of values, certainly platforms, that gets reproduced, but then gets detached from the cachet of the university when possible, so that it can be spread more broadly to other kind of social and socioeconomic contexts, and looks less elitist, less threatening, less exclusive. So I think that's definitely something going on. I'm not sure that there's a direct line that connects Dr. Goebbels to Dr. Bannon or Dr. Lehnert, but I am arguing, I suppose I have to own that argument, I am arguing that the diffuse metapolitical organizing they're all doing and networking, which seems like lateral, you know, it's not hierarchical, it's lateral, is still a form of propaganda. It's just the today's media landscape's version of propaganda, which isn't quite as top-down anymore, but can spread in different ways. So I do think there is that's why I distinguish, you know, I don't think they're National Socialists, but there's something fascistic that I think I would strongly see.
So I see, Chris. And others who have questions can feel free to try to signal to me, and I'll come around to you.
I noticed the Martin Sellner's podcast. One of the titles that you had up on the screen of one of the episodes was Israel versus Iran. Oh. I'm wondering the place of, you know, the state of Israel in contemporary German politics acts as a kind of performative Vergangenheitsbewältigung, right? Yeah. But is also weaponized as kind of, you know, anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia and mobilization against migrants, all these kinds of things. So I'm wondering, for these new right personalities, what is the place of Jews, right? Yeah. Either in contemporary Europe or in their kind of historical imagination, or in their kind of geopolitical alliance building.
Yeah, that's a really important question that I don't think I have a systematic answer. I know that they courted Netanyahu's son for the AfD, and Susan Neiman reports that the AfD has tried to recruit her to their cause. Like, I mean, I don't know if you know who Susan Neiman is. She directs the Einstein Forum and is very outspoken on. She wrote this book, Learning from the Germans, which is about German and American memory cultures, comparatively very interesting. And she has a biography that leads her from the US through Israel to Germany to direct this institute, where she often becomes tokenized as Jewish, and including by the far right. So that's a remarkable development. So the instrumentalization of Israeli and or Jewish people on the far right has examples. I think your question opens a much bigger, you know, like the kind of the discursive position of the Jew or of Jewishness in far right thinking today. And what I've tried to do in the lectures is to suggest that it's structurally anti-Semitic, and that it inherits, you know, anti-Semitism as a modus operandi. But that's different from like having an answer about the place of Jewishness or Israel-Palestine, or, you know, the kind of more specifically political instrumentalization. I don't think I have a kind of ready answer for that, but I think it's at the heart of what one needs to understand about the new right. Yeah. Yeah, there's somebody in the back, but then, yeah.
Well, maybe
okay, since you're up front, yeah. Okay,
there,
yeah. Go ahead.
I'm almost embarrassed to ask this question, but I'm going to. How do you respond to the educated elite, because you know that's what is so much behind a lot of the resistance to whatever. how do you respond to? How do we respond? I'm not one of the an intellectual elite for sure. I have a college education. I have a beyond college education. So but I'm not a you. Okay. How do we respond to that?
To the accusation that the intellectual elite has lost the.
You're the ones that are wrong. You're the ones that are wrong.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
the ones that are
right.
leading us into
Right.
these
Right.
horrible conditions, and you're the ones who
Right.
they're fighting against. People are
Yeah,
fighting against.
yeah. Oof. Yeah, I mean, it's behind the attack on DEI, it's behind the attack on the universities today. It's different, I think, here than in Germany. I tried to draw that out in the way that the comparisons work, that I think there's the populist strain here is stronger and more anti-academic than in Germany, where they would invoke, the Gegenuni, the university, as a thing, whereas PragerU is, it's a dog whistle almost, to call it PragerU. Whereas the Gegenuni wants to be, a serious. We do seminars, we educate, we connect thinking to practice, and we read Marx. They do that in those seminars. So we read the left as well as the right. So they want to be taken more seriously than here. I'd have to think about it. I do want to insist on truth as a category that academic work is designed to elicit, and that it is engaged in countering lies, and that that's a distinction I would uphold, even in light of everything I've said about the intentional confusion of truth and lying, or especially in light of what I've said about the intentional confusion of truth and lying, even though I'm not super optimistic about converting anybody back to a rational or a truth-based discourse, or to a scholarship-based arguments. I do think we need the universities as places that continue producing the distinction between truth and lies.
Thank you.
No, thanks, yeah.
We'll go to Ludwig Decker.
Thanks again for a great talk. Thanks for the last 3 days. So we've learned that metapolitics basically tries to prepare the ground for actual political takeover, right? So like this takeover arguably took place here in the United States. So my question is, do you think, can we already see that metapolitics changes like after this stage? Are we entering like a new stage where even the meta in metapolitics might actually drop? Like what's the new function of this form of political and cultural activism?
Also a great question. So as I said on the first day, this is one of the things I grapple with, is that what I've been thinking about for the last 10 years off and on keeps on being leapfrogged by developments, but I haven't put it to myself in quite those terms. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. I mean, my point about Bannon being really close to Trump all the time is that, yes, he kind of plies his metapolitical trade, but he'll trade that in for actual political power. How has it changed? Time will tell, but things that I would look at would be something like, I don't know if you caught Project 1776 on the way out of the Trump. It was like the last day of the Trump administration, #1. They published the 1776 report, which was one of these tit-for-tats on the 1619 project by Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times, saying, if we learn about slavery from 1619 on, then we're all saddled with white guilt, and this is terrible for our education. We're going to ruin our children's futures. And structural racism is an invention, is a DEI invention on the left, and we need patriotic education. So they created this document. So arguably it's not metapolitics because it's policy, but it's kind of like the Trump Academy that I described, which was, this is virtue signaling on the right. We're going to, it was a striking document that I read when it came out, and then was shocked to see how often, and it was immediately taken back. So the administration changed. Biden took it down on day one, I think. And so you could think that, okay, this is like when they're out of power, but I was shocked to see how often that project bubbled up in discussions of Florida curricula, in these school board kind of activism, and the school board activism that you saw on the grassroots right, in the book bans at libraries. All these things picked up explicitly the same language as the 1776 project. And then, if you read, I think it's chapter 11 in Project 2025, it's there again. It's the blueprint for the rewriting of the education planning under the still to be confirmed. Is she confirmed, McMahon now? The new education, still to be confirmed, new education secretary. So I suppose I would say right now I would read it as a fluid landscape where policy and metapolitics work hand in glove. Whether that changes the role of theory, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. When you start, re-theorizing what you've done, what happens after a revolution in terms of theoretical either justification or revisionism, I wouldn't dare to say at this point. But I think watching that space is a really good idea. Yeah.
Juliana Chamidas, and then.
Thank you. Thanks for another really thought-provoking lecture and discussion. I love how you invite us into this rather dark space with you.
Sorry.
Okay, so my question is about fault lines, and it's inspired by that final quotation you had up on your final slide from Prophets of Deceit. And it does tie into our conversation yesterday about the New Left as well. And yeah, exactly, this one.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to learn more about this quote in its context in the book, and specifically whether Lowenthal and Guterman offer a way out, because as you gave us a little bit of the context, which is their own wrestling with the paradox of democracy, which presumes to include the minority and speak on behalf of the minority and defend the minority's rights, but de facto ends up privileging the majority. Yeah. So yes, they are correct that there's this absolutely distorting inversion that, let's call it, the agitator carries out, right? Because they also don't represent the minority in any meaningful sense, right? That's not actually why they're pointing out this paradox, but the paradox is real. And so I'm just curious whether they offer a way out of the left, let's say, from the paradox that does something other than campaign for minority rights,
right?
If that makes sense. So that's a fault line that I am curious about, and then probably later I'll ask you about a fault line within this whole movement, which we could sort of summarize as the Bannon v. Musk fault line, but which seems even inherent to the accelerationist view, which is, are we talking about capitalists on steroids, or are we talking about anti-capitalists?
Right.
And perhaps, the anti-capitalists see capitalism on steroids as the way to get to anti-capitalism. Good luck with that, especially in the age of AI. But anyway, that is probably best for an extended second conversation. So we can focus on this fault lines of democracy question.
Yeah. Well, you've really it's like you've drunk the Kool-Aid. Yeah, it's like that's. I mean, you know, putting capitalism on steroids. Yeah, the one that I've been pouring out. Like,
Yes.
you know, thinking of capitalism on steroids as a way to an anti-capitalist future is exactly the accelerationist manifesto. But I think, you know, just to put a pin in it, you know, I said they borrow Benoit and Althusser minus the Marxism. I am of the persuasion that they do the same thing with accelerationism, right? Without minus the capitalism critique. So I don't see, I certainly don't see a critique of capitalism. I see a critique of neoliberalism. So and that's confounding, and you know, for further work, especially on this last part that I presented, that's really important because the Frankfurt School was nothing if not a critical theory of neoliberalism. And so there's a conversion that you have to grapple with, that, you know, yes, the new right also wants to attack neoliberalism as the basis for its proselytizing. So they kind of start from the same point. But the reason I have this up here is because that's where they diverge, right? Then one makes the critique of neoliberalism in favor of some idea of justice, emancipation, and equality, and the other makes it very explicitly in terms of protection of majority rights, ethnonationalism, and exclusion. And I think that, you know, that's one of the things I think one does need to name over and over again. That it's not, that's what I keep on saying, it's false equivalencies, right? So yes, they're both critics of neoliberalism, but from there, we go in really different directions. What's tough about this, and I'll try to get back to the Löwenthal, although I'd have to look again at the exact passage where they're writing. What's tough about this, of course, this quote, is that this goes to that paradox that you're talking about, that we talked about yesterday too, that a democracy can't guarantee its own reproduction because somebody can use and weaponize the democracy against itself, including by saying, well, democracy is majority rule. So why should I protect minorities? It's not. That's already an ethical conception of democracy, which, who says I have to be ethical about politics? So that's a tricky point, and I think it speaks to what I was calling the normative definition of democracy that you find in the critical theorists, because they just posit any democracy worth its salt protects individuals, but that's an added ingredient to the basic definition of democracy as rule of the people. And they have a different normative idea of democracy, but they use democracy as a term. So that's the democratic cloak trick that you find. But yeah, let's talk more.
Thank you.
Hello, yes. So my question kind of revolves around with, you had mentioned with like the Steve Bannon podcast that like even the advertising aspects of it being centered around the kind of message as well. And I think that's also certainly true, like with Alex Jones hawking alternative supplements and such during his show throughout. And I kind of read that as this kind of utilizing the message as well to have this kind of scam or grift going on as a way to like make money from from this as well. I was curious, I might have just missed it, but in the German podcast that you mentioned as well, like is this a uniquely American thing to utilize this advertising landscape for capitalistic gains, or the message for capitalistic gains, or is it something that you find in other metapolitical movements in other countries as well?
So my quick answer is yes, totally American. The longer answer is I would love for somebody who's better equipped than me for like ethnographic economic research to chase down the money. Because if it's not about advertising or clicks, I don't think, I mean, these they're on many platforms, so you never know how many people actually see or engage with this content. But I don't think it's huge. I mean, this goes to the question with the discussion we had yesterday about, you know, trickle down. How does, you know, where does this land? Who does it land with? Where does it get replicated? I think the networks are important, but there's no monetizing of this in Schnellruder. And people have asked the question, how does Schnellroda finance itself? Also the academies, if you're under 35, you attend for, I think, 50 euros for 3 days of an academy, and I think they put you up and you get food. I mean, so I want to know. And there's, you know, nobody's been able to, and there have been investigative journalists who've tried to follow down the money, and they get blocked at every turn. Like there's people refuse to let them follow them for understandable reasons. And then all you end up with is these kind of conspiracy theories that start mirroring the others, and you don't want to go there. So that would be really interesting. I think in terms of the ecosystem of the podcast, yeah, that's a totally different podcasting type, which is not the kind of host-read advertising. And yes, Alex Jones does it too, and yeah, and it's the same stuff, prepper kits and supplements, and yeah.
So if we're to understand metapolitics taking a long march through institutions, I think that's what you use, how do you see that march occurring in American universities or German? I mean, I can see a few ways, but I'm just, if we think of that both as the bulwark against it, but
marching through them.
How do you see it actually working at your own university or any?
Yeah. That's also. I mean, what I talked about a little bit is the kind of out in the open attempts to weaponize free speech against the universities that we saw. I feel like more in the first. Well, who knows whether it's coming back? But you know, Richard Spencer trying to speak at institutions in order to confront them with their own authoritarianism, right? To show that they're going to actually enforce a ban on free speech, and then you've kind of eroded some of the raison d'etre of the university. That's always the claim. So Turning Points USA is the Charlie Kirk organization. It's really dedicated to that and kind of trains armies of students. I'm not sure, that's a few years back that I was looking at that, so I'm not sure if they're doing that now. And I guess now I would say it's a top-down. It's a top-down. You don't need to march through the institutions when you've got government, so you just outright attack the universities from the top and bleed them dry, which I don't know what messages you're getting every day in your inboxes, but I just got another one that the president decided to put our hiring on hold. So unless the offer's out, the president's office, wants to review the hiring, which there goes faculty governance. So you start eroding and changing the institutions, making them, I think we have all sensed it, making them more corporate. And you could blame that on the people who've been running them and running up endowments and things like that. But I think it's a two-way system with hydraulic pressure from the top. But that's the current situation. So I think your question stands. I think it's a good one. Like, what would it mean to think about the march through the institutions in a more granular way? Like, where does it happen in seminars? What does it mean for fraternities in Germany to really try to? They create communes inside and that's what they did. And it didn't last long, but that was one of the attempts. Like, create a living community in Leipzig under the Identitarian label, and then get many people there to kind of take humanities courses and sort of disrupt them from the inside. I should shut up, yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Frau Ashkenazi.
Thank you. I'm still overwhelmed, but two very quick points, maybe a little bit optimistic. What you described today and in the past 3 days have happened, as you showed, it happened in the past, but in many cases it didn't work.
Right.
Right. So
yes.
There's still a missing link of why it doesn't work in many cases, and sometimes it does. But what you just described about the universities, it's something else. It's institutional. It's coming from above. This is not metapolitics.
Yes.
And this obviously is very dangerous, but this is not. So there's something, I mean, if one of three Americans were hearing the radio shows, that did not lead to authoritarian regime here, and it basically was just a precursor for the end of segregation and so forth. So something is still missing. And I have one more point that it is, it's different, I think. Steve Bannon is different than what we hear in Germany when they talk about remigration, because remigration is very different than what the NPD would say 15 years ago. So when the NPD would say horrible things that would be totally outside of the discourse, right? What they say today is they are accepting a lot of the liberal discourse, and they use it to their own benefit and so forth, but they are accepting that colonization is very bad. We are colonized, but it's very bad, right?
Yeah.
I think there is something that it's very bad, but it's not all dark. There is some movement to the center from that side.
I like both of your impulses, although you had the formulation that something's still missing in terms of the kind of chain or the escalator that leads from the past to the present, and it's not just a kind of flourishing of fascist sentiment. That's a pretty slim hope, like something is still missing. They just need another couple pieces to put them. Because the inverse of that is, and again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself from really, truly fascinating conversations I've had with many of you, that I do think that this is the long game where things gradually add up and you go from the movement phase to the regime phase. I mean, that might be overstating it a little bit, but I think, all these movement moments, they go underground, they get pushed underground, but if you look at the broadcasting history, which is why I went to that, there is a real continuity that gets you through, from Coughlin, through Pat Buchanan, to Rush Limbaugh, to Steve Bannon. And that, maybe it's just a continuity and we always have them and that's those are the skies of democracy. Or maybe that's what then enables a Trump regime to take hold. So that would be the pessimistic reformulation of your optimism, which I would like to share. And I do share. I think, did I quote this the other day? When Angela Davis was there last week at Michigan, she said, the activism part is really hard. You get, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, then you get 1 step forward, 3 steps back, and then you get 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then you get 4 steps forward, 2 steps back, and then you're ahead, is what she said. So I thought that was great. And she's really, if you want somebody with experience to tell you, that's pretty great. So I think there is and there should be room for optimism and other ways of reading this. Your other thought, I think really interesting. So I've been saying that the right borrows leftist concepts and turns them on their head. You're basically saying, but they're still, progressive concepts. They're still usable as progressive concepts, and they might reinfect their use by the right, if I heard you correctly, which I think would be a very appealing way of thinking about why the critique of metapolitics matters, because you can also retrieve, reappropriate those terms, and maybe recognize the truth value of the critique of neoliberalism, for example. So if that's where you're heading, I would agree.
Well, I think we can end on that at least somewhat optimistic note. So let's thank Professor von Moltke for 3 really fantastic lectures.
Yeah, thank you all for coming and helping me think. This is really inspiring. And again, thanks for all these great conversations. Thanks for 3 days of hosting also. I look forward to dinner. And I hope to see many of you on the circuit. Thanks.